Henry Plummer may be the most debated figures in the Old West. To some, he was the ultimate outlaw sheriff, a polished, well-spoken lawman who wore a badge in public while secretly directing a gang of robbers and killers across the Montana goldfields. To others, he was a flawed but wrongly condemned man, hanged without a trial by vigilantes who may have needed a villain to justify their own violence. In this episode, I'm not here to tell you Plummer was definitely guilty, or definitely innocent. I'm going to lay out the full story as best I can. The accusations, the robberies, the killings, the vigilantes, the confessions, the contradictions, and the lack of hard evidence. And then, leave it up to you. So after you watch, comment what you think. Was Henry Plummer truly the Outlaw Sheriff of Bannack? Or was he an innocent man sent to the noose? Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. William Henry Plummer was born in 1832 in Washington County, Maine, though some accounts place his birth specifically in Addison. His family name was originally spelt with only one M, though history has largely remembered him with two. He was the youngest son of 7 children, born into a family with deep ties to the sea. His father, William Jeremiah Plummer, was a sea captain. His older brother followed the same path, and so did his brother-in-law. In a coastal Maine family like his, the expectation was clear enough. Henry would grow up, become a seaman, and carry on the family tradition. But Henry was not well suited for the sea. He was a slight build, intelligent, and by most accounts, physically fragile. He suffered from consumption, and the hard life of a sailor would have been difficult for him to endure. Instead of being sent into the same trade as other men in his family, he received what was described as a good early education near the family farm. Even so, Plummer seems to have carried the same restless spirit that had drawn his relatives across the ocean. He may not have been built for life aboard a ship, but he was still drawn towards distance, opportunity, and the chance to make something of himself somewhere far from home. When he was still a teenager, his father died, and the family's financial situation became more difficult. By then, news of the California goldfields had spread across the country. Gold had been discovered in California in January of 1848, and by 1849, the rush was in full force. Men from every corner of the United States were leaving homes, farms, shops, and families behind, convinced that fortune waited somewhere in the streams and mountains of the far west, and Henry Plummer was one of them. At 19 years old, he promised his widowed mother that he could go west, make his fortune, and help support the family. In April, he left New York aboard a mail ship bound for Aspinwall, Panama. From there, he crossed the isthmus by mule train to Panama City, then boarded another vessel for the final leg of the journey to California. And if you're like me and had no idea what an isthmus is, it is, quote, a narrow strip of land connecting 2 large land masses and separating 2 bodies of water. It is essentially a land bridge. It was a hard route, but a fast one compared to the overland trail. In just 24 days, Henry Plummer had crossed from the Atlantic side of the country to the Pacific. By late May, he arrived in San Francisco. But like so many men who came west dreaming of gold, Plummer did not step off the ship into instant wealth. His money was soon gone, and before he could make his way into the mining country, he had to take work where he could find it. One account says he found employment in a bookstore, while another says he first worked in a bakery. Either way, the pattern is the same. Plummer did not immediately become a miner, gambler, lawman, or outlaw. He began as a young man trying to survive in California. After about a year, he had saved enough money to move into the mining region in Nevada County, roughly 150 miles northeast of San Francisco. There, he began to build a life for himself. Documents and later accounts indicate that he owned a ranch and a mine near Nevada City. A short time later, he traded some of his mining shares for a business in town, identified in one account as the Empire Bakery. Nevada City was no small backwoods camp. By the mid-1850s, it was one of the most important settlements in California, and at one point was considered the 3rd largest settlement in the state. It was a place of miners, merchants, gamblers, laborers, and ambitious young men trying to rise quickly in a new country. Plummer seems to have done exactly that. He became known as a capable businessman, and the people around him were impressed by his conduct. He was young, polished, well-mannered, and apparently trusted by the merchants and citizens of the town. By 1856, when he was only 24 years old, those same citizens persuaded him to run for town marshal. He would go on to win the election by a narrow margin. Once in office, Plummer quickly earned a reputation as an energetic and effective lawman. According to one local description, he was prompt and energetic in his duties, but when resisted, he became, quote, as bold and determined as a lion. That reputation was strengthened by episodes like his pursuit of Jim Webster, a murder suspect accused of terrorizing 2 counties. Plummer tracked Webster and a companion, found them asleep with pistols under their heads, quietly removed the weapons, and took both men into custody. For a young man who arrived in California with little money and uncertain health, Plummer had risen quickly. By 1857, he was popular enough to win re-election. His reputation was strong enough that Democrats chose him to run for the California State Assembly. At just 24 or 25 years old, he seemed on the edge of a much larger political future. Some believed he might be the youngest man sent to the California legislature. But that future collapsed almost as quickly as it had appeared. The Democratic Party split into rival factions, and the campaign turned ugly. A smear campaign damaged Plummer's name, and instead of moving on to Sacramento, he suffered an humiliating defeat. Still, that loss alone did not destroy him. Plummer remained a young marshal with a strong record, a public name, and enough charisma that he might have rebuilt his career. But then came the trouble with John and Lucy Vedder. The Vedders were living in Nevada City, and their marriage was deeply troubled. John Vedder was described as a gambler and an abusive husband. According to the more sympathetic version of the story, he beat Lucy, abandoned her at times, and left her and their sickly daughter in desperate conditions. At one point, when the family needed housing, John was told that people in trouble could go to Plummer for advice. Plummer listened to him and allowed the Vedders to rent his own home. Soon after, witnesses saw signs of violence inside that home. One passerby heard cries, rushed to the door, and saw John Vedder beating Lucy. Another neighbor later said John knocked her to the floor and pinched her nose until she could scarcely breathe. When Plummer heard of this, he stepped in. He arranged protection for Lucy and sent a lawyer to counsel her. According to this version, Lucy wanted a divorce, and John became enraged. He began threatening Plummer, telling people he intended to kill him. Plummer confronted him and tried to calm the situation, reportedly telling John that he was his friend and would not resent him even if he spit in his face. For a time, that cooled things down, but the peace did not last. According to the account by History.net, on the night Lucy was to catch a departing 2 a.m. stage, Plummer sent her usual guard and at midnight arrived to assume the duty himself. As Plummer sat by the stove watching Lucy pack, John tiptoed up the back stairs, swung open the door, and pointed a pistol at him, saying, "Your time has come." John then fired twice. Both shots missed, and Plummer fired back, hitting his target. Mortally wounded, John fell down the stairs, collapsed, and drew his final breath. Lucy dashed out in the street, crying hysterically that the marshal had killed her husband. That is one version. Another version is much less sympathetic to Plummer. In that telling, Plummer was said to be having an affair with Lucy, and that John Vedder confronted him over it. The killing then becomes less a matter of a lawman protecting an abused woman, and more a violent end to a scandalous relationship. Whatever the truth, the killing became a sensational case. Plummer was tried twice, the case was emotionally charged, and the question of his relationship with Lucy hung over everything. A jury eventually convicted him of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 10 years in San Quentin. By then, his health was failing badly, his consumption worsening in the dark and damp conditions of San Quentin. Supporters came to his defense, a petition asking for clemency describing him as a young man of excellent character, and was signed by more than 100 officials from 2 counties. Governor John Weller granted him a pardon, though he did so on less controversial grounds, saying that Plummer was in imminent danger of dying from consumption. Plummer was released and returned to Nevada City. He was disgraced, weakened, and marked by his prison record, but he did not disappear. As his health slowly improved, he resumed mining and tried to live again among the people who had once known him as a marshal. Yet trouble continued to find him. At one point, he made a citizen's arrest of a San Quentin escapee known as 10-Year Smith. Later, he attempted to arrest another escapee, a man known as Buckskin Bill Riley. During that encounter, Riley attacked him with a Bowie knife and slashed Plummer across the forehead. Plummer then shot and killed him. Afterward, he surrendered himself to the police. The officers reportedly believed he had acted in self-defense, but they also understood that his prison record could make a fair trial difficult. Rather than hold him, they advised him to leave the area and allowed him to walk away. From there, Plummer moved farther north. Eventually, he followed the Gold Rush Trail into Washington Territory and the mining regions around Lewiston and Orofino. By this time, his name had already been connected with violence, scandal, and prison. He had also crossed paths with men whose names would later appear again in the darkest chapters of his story. In Lewiston, the account begins to divide sharply. Some describe Plummer as continuing to act, at least at times, like a man of law and order. One account says he helped break up a lynch mob by speaking against mob violence and arguing that even men accused of murder should not be killed without due process. Others describe him in much darker terms. According to Nathaniel P. Langford, in his book, Vigilante Days and Ways, The Pioneers of the Rockies, Plummer arrived in Lewiston in the spring of 1861, with the appearance of a gentleman, accompanied by a woman who seemed to be his wife. Within days, Langford says, Plummer was known as a gambler, and before long, he had abandoned the woman, leaving her destitute in a frontier town. Langford then claims Plummer fell in with men like Jack Cleveland, Cherokee Bob, and Bill Bunton, and that from this circle grew a band of desperate men who preyed on miners, travelers, and gold shipments. Langford's account paints Plummer as the organizer of a criminal network in the northern mining camps. He describes shebanes, or hidden rendezvous points along the roads, where robbers watched the movement of travelers and waited for chances to strike. He ties Plummer to attempted robberies, mysterious disappearances, and a general atmosphere of fear on the roads between Lewiston, Walla Walla, and the interior camps. But this is also where caution matters. Langford's version is vivid, dramatic, and written with certainty, but it is also part of the tradition that made Plummer into a master criminal. Other accounts are far less certain. Some of the events Langford connects to Plummer are difficult to prove independently, and in several places, the story depends on accusation, reputation, and later memory more than firm evidence. The Patrick Ford killing shows how sharply the versions differ. In one account, Ford, a saloon keeper in Orofino, threw Plummer and his companions out of his dance hall, followed them to a stable, and fired at them with 2 guns. Plummer fired back and killed him. A correspondent from the Sacramento Union later reported that people in the area agreed Plummer had acted defensively. But in Langford's version, Ford was a brave opponent of the criminal element, a man who had urged the people to organize against the robbers. Plummer and his associates, in that telling, were part of the very gang Ford opposed. Langford described a confrontation in which Ford stood against them and was shot down by Plummer and his companions. So again, the same event can be told in 2 very different ways. In one version, Plummer is a hunted man defending himself from an attacker. In another, he is part of a violent gang eliminating a threat. By late fall of 1862, Plummer appears to have grown tired, sick, and perhaps desperate to leave the West behind. His tuberculosis was still with him, and after years of violence, scandal, and wandering, he decided to return home to Maine. He made his way toward Fort Benton, the head of navigation on the Missouri River, intending to take a steamboat east. But the river was closed, frozen over. Unable to leave, Plummer stayed in the region and took work at the Sun River Farm, a government ranch and Indian agency. There, he met James Vale, the agent in charge of the farm. He also encountered Jack Cleveland, a rough horse trader and old acquaintance from California. Cleveland and Plummer had a history between them, and not a friendly one. According to one account, Cleveland had followed Plummer from California, drinking heavily and boasting that he was hunting his meat, meaning Henry Plummer. Other accounts describe Cleveland as a former partner in crime. Either way, the 2 men distrusted one another. Both men had become attracted to the same young woman, Electa Bryan. Electa was the sister-in-law of James Vale. Plummer had met her there while staying at the stockade, and according to the more sympathetic accounts, she awakened something in him that had almost gone dead. He was sick, tired, and battered by the life he had lived across California, Washington, and Idaho. He had been a lawman, a prisoner, a wanderer, and a killer in more than one violent encounter. But with Electa, he seems to have imagined a different future. But Cleveland and Plummer's feud only heightened. They quarreled, exchanged bitter words, and neither man seemed willing to leave the area unless the other left too. So in the winter of 1862-63, Henry Plummer and Jack Cleveland left Sun River together, with Plummer telling Electa he would come back to marry her. Their destination was Bannack, Idaho Territory. By the time Henry Plummer reached Bannack, he was already carrying a history that could be read two very different ways. To some, he was a man who had tried again and again to live inside the law, only to be dragged into violent circumstances by bad luck, bad company, and the brutal world around him. To others, he was a polished killer, a gambler, and a fugitive who had simply learned how to wear respectability like a coat. Bannack would become the place where those two versions of Henry Plummer collided. Bannack was one of the newest gold camps in the mountains, and like so many mining towns, it grew faster than order could follow. Men poured in after the discovery of gold along Grasshopper Creek. They came with picks, pans, pistols, debts, grudges, and hopes of sudden wealth. Some came to work claims, some came to sell goods, some came to gamble, and some came because a gold camp, crowded with men and money and weak law, was one of the best places in the world for a criminal to disappear or make a living. The town was raw, cold, and unfinished. Cabins, saloons, and rough businesses appeared almost overnight. Authority was improvised. Justice was often decided by miners' meetings, quick trials, and the judgment of armed men standing in a room together. In a place like Bannack, a man's reputation mattered, but so did the question of who drew first. On the 14th of January 1863, Plummer and Cleveland's feud finally erupted. The confrontation took place in Goodrich's saloon. Plummer was inside near the fire when Cleveland came in drinking, loud and aggressive. According to Dimsdale and Noyes in the Vigilantes of Montana, Cleveland had already been saying, especially when intoxicated, that he intended to kill Plummer. Langford gives a similar picture, Cleveland entering the saloon with a swagger, and hinted that he knew damaging things about men from the other side. That phrase mattered, because if Cleveland really did know Plummer's past, then his threats were not just drunken boasting, they were dangerous. He may have known enough to ruin Plummer's standing in Bannack, or, if the darker accounts are to be believed, he knew enough to expose Plummer as something far worse than a respectable newcomer. Inside the saloon, Cleveland's anger first seemed directed at another man, Jeff Perkins, over an old debt. But Plummer intervened. He told Cleveland to behave himself, and the tension in the room rose. Cleveland kept reaching toward his pistol. Plummer warned him. Then, according to the more favorable version, Plummer fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Cleveland still would not back down. Twice he went for his gun, and twice Plummer fired before Cleveland could shoot. Cleveland was mortally wounded. Langford's version is harsher. He describes Plummer sprinting to his feet in a rage, drawing his pistol and firing repeatedly. Cleveland dropped, pleaded that Plummer not shoot him while he was down. Plummer then says he won't and tells him to get up, and once he does, Plummer shoots him again. In Langford's telling, Plummer's fear was not merely that Cleveland might kill him, but that Cleveland might reveal him. That is the difference between these accounts. In one version, Plummer survives a threatened attack. In the other, Plummer silences a man who knew too much. Cleveland was carried to the lodging of Hank Crawford, a butcher and respected citizen. He lived for about 3 hours. During that time, Crawford later claimed that Plummer was intensely interested in what Cleveland had to say about him. According to Dimsdale, Plummer asked more than once whether Cleveland had revealed anything. When told that Cleveland had said nothing, Plummer reportedly answered that it was well for him, or he would have killed him in his bed. That line, if true, is chilling. But even then, the legal judgment of Bannack went Plummer's way. He was tried by a miner's jury and acquitted. Witnesses testified that Cleveland had threatened him, and under the rough code of the camps, self-defense often turned on who had reached for a weapon first. So Plummer remained free, and in the months that followed, he did more than remain free. He rose. By the spring of 1863, Bannack needed law. The camp was growing, the surrounding mines were spreading, and the old systems of temporary minor courts and armed meetings were not enough to keep the order. A sheriff was needed, not just for Bannack itself, but for the surrounding mining districts. According to one version, Plummer was elected in May of 1863 by a large majority, with more support than any other official. A Sacramento Union reporter even wrote that no man stood higher in the estimation of the community than Henry Plummer. It was the choice of the miners who believed he was capable, intelligent, and effective. He had experience as a lawman, he knew mining camps, he knew dangerous men, and in a rough place, that kind of experience mattered. After his election, Plummer organized a network of deputies throughout the camps. He returned to Sun River and married Electa Bryan in June, brought her to Bannack, and settled her into their log home. He also pushed for the construction of a jail, arguing that a real detention facility was needed to replace the habit of immediate hangings. He personally collected subscriptions for it, reportedly at $2.50 apiece, and helped build what has been described as the first jail in what is now Montana. That is an important part of the story, because it does not fit neatly with the image of a bloodthirsty outlaw. The Plummer remembered in some early diaries and account is not a man openly terrorizing the town. He is described as Gentile, neat, well-dressed, and active in his duties. He is seen patrolling the streets at dawn. Even Nathaniel Langford, no friend to Plummer, admitted that he had a remarkable executive ability, and that, for a time, people came to him for counsel more often than almost anyone else in Bannack. Langford even records a conversation in which Plummer seemed to speak of reform. According to Langford, Plummer told him that his bad association from California and Nevada had followed him, but that he had been forced to kill in self-defense and had been unfairly branded a desperado. Now that he was married and had something to live for and held an official position, he wanted to prove that he could be a good man among good men. That moment matters because in Langford's hostile account, there is a brief glimpse of another possibility. Maybe Plummer did want to change, maybe he was trying to rebuild himself, maybe Bannack gave him one last chance at respectability. But Langford did not believe that chance lasted. In his version, Plummer's polished conduct was a mask. He says that beneath that sheriff's badge, Plummer was still tied to the old criminal element. He claims Bannack filled with desperados from west of the mountains, Charlie Reeves, Moore, Cyrus Skinner, George Ives, and others who would later become infamous in the Vigilante story. Around these men, according to Langford and Dimsdale, a road agent organization formed, with Plummer being at the head of all of it. The heart of the traditional story is that Henry Plummer, the sheriff of Bannack, was secretly used in his office to help rob the very camps he had been elected to protect. In that version, his deputies were not simply lawmen, but part of the same criminal web. The road agents had spies, lookouts, hidden camps, secret signs, passwords, and an oath of loyalty. Rendezvous points including Rattlesnake Ranch were said to have served as places where the outlaws watched the roads and waited for gold shipments. According to the Vigilante tradition, this was not random crime. It was organized. It stretched between Bannack, Virginia City, and the surrounding roads. Langford and Dimsdale describe robberies, disappearances, murders, and men vanishing with money, never to be heard from again. They claimed more than 100 people were killed by the road agents, with others supposedly buried in secret places, their bodies never found. But this is where the skeptical side has to be heard. When you step back from the legend and ask what can actually be proven, the picture becomes much less certain. According to the more skeptical account from History.net, the final months of 1863 did see crime in the Bannack and Alder Gulch region, but not necessarily the massive wave of organized murder later described by the Vigilante writers. That account narrows the major known crimes in Plummer's jurisdiction to 4 alarming events: 1 murder, 2 stage robberies, and an attempted robbery of a freight caravan. That does not mean the country was safe. It doesn't mean there were no robbers, and it doesn't mean people were not afraid. But it does challenge the idea of a perfectly organized criminal empire committing more than 100 murders under Plummer's command. The skeptical argument is that the Innocents may have been less a proven organization than a mining camp rumor that grew in the telling. The name itself may have come from suspected road agents declaring, "I am innocent," until that phrase hardened into the supposed name of a secret band. Because Plummer was sheriff, because he had a violent past, because he knew dangerous men, and because some of those men later ended up on a vigilante death list, suspicion naturally settled on him. Men like George Ives, Boone Helm, Clubfoot George Lane, Cyrus Skinner, Buck Stinson, Ned Ray, and others became part of the larger story surrounding the so-called Innocents. And Plummer had the intelligence, charm, and organizational abilities to lead such a band if he wanted to. Even his enemies admitted he had the ability to command men. If you want to hear about the legend of Boone Helm, the cannibal outlaw, go check out my last video. But for now, back to Henry Plummer. By late 1863, fear and frustration in the mining camps had reached a breaking point. There had been robberies, men had been killed, travelers were afraid to move gold across the roads. Miners and merchants knew the country around Bannack and Alder Gulch was dangerous, and in a place where courts were weak, distant, or improvised, many citizens believed the ordinary machinery of law could not protect them. And that is what makes Plummer's role so difficult to judge. If he was innocent, his actions could be read as the efforts of a frontier lawman trying to bring order to a place that was impossible to govern. Building a jail could mean trying to replace immediate hangings with something closer to legal process. Organizing deputies could mean stretching law enforcement across a scattered and dangerous region. Riding the roads could mean protecting travelers. Speaking against vigilante hangings could mean defending due process. But if he was guilty, every one of those actions could be turned around. The jail could become a symbol of false respectability. The deputy network could become a criminal information system. Riding the roads could mean gathering intelligence. Knowing when men were traveling with gold could become the perfect advantage for a road agent chief. And speaking against the vigilantes could look less like defending the law and more like trying to protect his own men. That is the problem with almost every piece of Henry Plummer's story. This same action could be read in two different ways. The traditional account says Plummer was the hidden leader of a vast criminal organization, a secret band of road agents, but the skeptical version asks a different question. Where's the hard evidence? Where's the reliable witnesses who are not speaking under fear of death? Where are the records that clearly connect Plummer to the crimes? Where are the bodies to match the enormous number of murders later claimed? Those questions became even sharper when you look at how the vigilantes claimed to confirm the existence of the gang. One of the key men was Long John Frank. According to the skeptical account, after the vigilantes had captured Long John, they put a noose around his neck and repeatedly hoisted him until, nearly strangled, he admitted there was a gang. But when he tried to lead them to the supposed headquarters, he came up empty-handed. Another key figure was Erastus Red Yeager. He was captured by the vigilantes and, before his execution, gave up the names of the road agents. According to Timsdale in the vigilante version, Red named Henry Plummer as the chief of the band, along with many others he claimed were involved. In that telling, the gang had structure. It had roles, it had rules, it had an oath, it had a password, it had a penalty of death for anyone who betrayed its secrets. And Red's confession became one of the pillars of the case against Plummer. But even there, the ground is not solid. The skeptical account points out that the supposed member lists do not all agree. There are multiple versions, and the names vary. Some men who are hanged do not appear on the list. That does not automatically make the confession false, but it does weaken the idea that the vigilantes were working from clean, reliable evidence. And most importantly, Red was not testifying calmly in a courtroom. He was a condemned man in the hands of armed vigilantes. So before the vigilante movement ever reached Plummer himself, the case was already tangled in fear, rumor, violence, and questionable confessions. From there, men from Bannack, Virginia City, and all the nearby camps began organizing in secret. They moved quickly, often at night, and began targeting suspected road agents. The hangings came in a rush, and soon, the attention turned toward Bannack. By January of 1864, Henry Plummer's name had been placed at the top of the list. By January of 1864, George Ives had been tried and hanged. Red Yeager and George Brown had been taken and executed in the Stinking Water Valley. Names were being passed from one vigilante group to another, and in the minds of the men now riding through the snow, the time for ordinary justice had passed. To them, Henry Plummer was not merely a suspicious sheriff. He was the chief, the head of the road agents, the man who, under the cover of a badge, had helped turn the roads of the mining country into killing grounds. But to those who question the old story, this was the very moment when suspicion became something far more dangerous, because Plummer had not been tried, he had not been brought into court. The evidence against him had not been tested in a formal way. The case rested largely on the word of condemned men, forced confessions, and the belief that a hidden organization had to exist behind the violence of the mining camps. And now, armed men were coming for Henry Plummer. On the 10th of January 1864, a group of vigilantes moved through Bannack. According to one version, they came to Plummer's cabin while he was sick and in bed. They lured him outside by claiming that a robbery suspect in custody was about to be lynched. Plummer, still the sheriff, stepped out unarmed and argued that the man had a right to a trial. If that version is true, then his final act as sheriff was to speak against the very kind of mob justice that was about to take his life. But Langford tells it differently. In his account, the vigilantes had received word from Virginia City, ordering the immediate execution of Plummer and his two deputies, Buck Stinson and Ned Ray. A branch organization was formed at Bannack, and when several horses belonging to the three men were seen in town, some citizens believed Plummer, Stinson, and Ray were preparing to flee. The decision was made to arrest and execute them at once. Stinson and Ray were taken first. One was arrested at a cabin, the other, according to Langford, was found stretched out on a gaming table in a saloon. Then the vigilantes went to Plummer's cabin. They found him washing his face. When told that he was wanted, he seemed calm. He said he would be ready in a moment, and he moved toward a chair where his coat was lying. But one of the vigilantes noticed the muzzle of a pistol sticking out from beneath the coat, and stepped forward to hand the coat to him himself. In doing so, he secured the pistol before Plummer could reach it. Langford says Plummer turned pale, though he maintained his composure. The meaning of that moment depends entirely on which version you believe. To Langford, the hidden pistol proved that Plummer was dangerous and ready to fight his way out. But to the skeptical side, it is just as easy to say that a sheriff in Bannack, surrounded by threats and violence, would naturally keep a weapon near him. Either way, the pistol was taken. Plummer was now in their hands. He was marched with Stinson and Ray toward the gallows, and there was a brutal irony in the place they took him. The gallows had been built during Plummer's time as sheriff. It had been part of his effort to bring some form of legal order to the camp, a way to move beyond spontaneous hangings and create a process of detention, judgment, and punishment. In the vigilante version, it became the proper instrument of retribution, the sheriff's own gallows waiting for a man who had betrayed the law. The structure stood up the gulch, away from the center of town, framed by pine timbers in the winter darkness. There was snow on the ground, the night was bitterly cold. Armed men surrounded the prisoners. Ned, Ray, and Buck Stinson cursed the vigilantes as they were led forward. Ray was hanged first, then Stinson. According to Langford, Stinson cried out that he would confess as the rope was being prepared. At that moment, Plummer reportedly said, quote, "We've done enough already, twice over, to send us to hell." That line has been repeated as one of the great damning statements of the Plummer story. If accurately remembered, it sounds like an admission, but even here, caution matters. It comes from the vigilante tradition, preserved by men who believed Plummer was guilty and wanted later readers to believe it too. It may be true, it may be shaped by memory, it may have been repeated because it fit the story people already wanted told. Then came Plummer's turn. Langsford account says that when the order was given to bring him forward, no one moved at first. Ray and Stinson were common villains in the eyes of the vigilantes, but Plummer was different. He was intelligent, polished, familiar, and had been sheriff of the district. To hang him was something heavier. Plummer begged for his life. He asked to live for his wife, Electa, who is no longer in Bannack. He asked for time to settle his affairs. He asked, according to Langford, for almost any punishment short of death. Cut off his ears, cut out his tongue, strip him naked in the freezing night and let him go, only spare his life. But the decision had already been made. When he asked for time to pray, one of the vigilantes supposedly answered that he could pray up there, pointing to the crossbeam of the gallows. At last, Plummer stopped pleading. Plummer removed his necktie and tossed it to a young man who had boarded with him, asking him to keep it as something to remember him by. Then he made one final request. He asked for a good drop. But he did not receive one in the clean, formal sense. According to the more skeptical account, there was no proper drop at all. His hands were bound, the noose was placed around his neck, and he was gradually hoisted into the air. Langsford's version says the vigilantes lifted his body high, and then let it fall so that he died quickly. Either way, this was not the orderly execution of a condemned man after trial. It was a lynching. On a moonless winter night in Bannack, Henry Plummer, sheriff of the district, was hanged by vigilantes. Afterwards, guards stood near the gallows. According to one account, the bodies of Plummer, Stinson, and Ray were left hanging until the following day. Plummer's body was reportedly the only one placed in a wooden coffin, but none of the three men were buried in the cemetery. Instead, they were placed in shallow graves in Hangman's Gulch, not far from the gallows. The vigilantes did not stop with Plummer. They continued hunting men they believed were part of the road agent organization. Hangings followed at Virginia City, Hellgate, Deer Lodge, Fort Owen, and other places. By the time the wave had passed, roughly 24 suspected road agents had been hanged in the winter of 1863-64. To the vigilantes and their defenders, this was the moment order returned. They believed they had destroyed the game. They believed that they had saved the mining country. In that telling, Henry Plummer's death was not murder, but necessity. A dangerous region that had been overrun by robbers and killers, and when the law could not act, the people had acted for themselves. and there is evidence that many people in Montana believed exactly that. Maurice E. Smith from History.net notes that nearly every prominent founder of Montana thought Plummer was guilty, and that even today, many people in southwestern Montana still believe he was guilty as charged. His violent past, his intelligence, his questionable associations, his deputies, and the alleged testimony of his supposed partners in crime all help put the rope around his neck. There is also the argument that violence declined after the hangings, and maybe it did, but even if that's true, it does not automatically prove Henry Plummer was the mastermind behind it all. Among the roughly 24 suspected road agents who were hanged, some have far stronger evidence against them than Plummer does. It is entirely possible that the vigilantes killed men who were genuinely dangerous, while still failing to prove that Plummer himself was the cause of the violence, or that his death was a reason it declined. But to Plummer's accusers, that decrease in crime mattered. If the murders and robberies slowed after he and the others were dead, then, in their minds, that proved the vigilantes had struck the right men. But the story does not end there. Because the more closely later historians looked at Henry Plummer's case, the less certain it became. Electa Bryan, Plummer's wife, learned of his death by letter. She maintained that he was innocent. Over time, others began asking the same question. Had the vigilantes exposed a hidden criminal empire, or had they created a story that justified what they had already done? There were reasons to doubt. Many of the early accounts that shaped Plummer's reputation were written by men close to the vigilantes, or by men sympathetic to them. Thomas Dimsdale writings helped turn the vigilantes into heroes. Langford's account, vivid and powerful as it is, presents Plummer as almost impossibly sinister. A polished gentleman with the soul of a murderer, a criminal genius hiding under courtesy and calm manners. But vivid writing is not the same as proof. According to the skeptical side, there is little hard evidence connecting Plummer directly to the crimes of the Bannack area, apart from the confessions and accusations of men who were already in the hands of vigilantes. Long John Frank was supposedly hoisted by the neck until he gave the answers his captors wanted. Red Yeager named Plummer, but he did so as a condemned man. Langford even admits that he was naming the best men of Bannack. The lists of supposed gang members do not all agree, and the location of the original list, if there truly was one, well, it's nowhere to be found, lost to history. And the enormous claim that more than 100 people had been murdered by the band is difficult to reconcile with the lack of bodies and reliable records. There is also the question of the robberies themselves. Some later researchers argue that the major crimes in Plummer's jurisdiction were far fewer than the old accounts claimed, just the 4 previously mentioned. Serious crimes, yes. Terrifying crimes, absolutely. But not necessarily proof of a vast, perfectly organized band led by the sheriff. And if the game was truly the most perfect criminal organization in the West, why did it not fight back as an organization when the vigilantes came? Why were so many members captured separately, sick, frightened, isolated, or unprepared? Why did Plummer, if he was the mastermind of a rich and ruthless band, leave no clear fortune behind? Where was the gold he supposedly accumulated? And why did so much of this case against him depend on men who were either defending vigilante action or speaking under the shadow of a rope? None of these questions prove Plummer is innocent. That is important. Henry Plummer was not a spotless man. By the time he reached Bannack, he had killed more than once. He had been convicted of murder in California. Even if later supporters believed that the killing was self-defense, he had still been imprisoned in San Quentin. He had been tied to gambling, violence, questionable companions, and ugly rumors. He knew dangerous men, and dangerous men knew him. Some of his deputies and associates were exactly the type of men a mining camp had reason to fear. So it is not hard to understand why people suspected him. It is not hard to understand why the vigilantes believed he was guilty. But suspicion is not proof. And that is where the Henry Plummer story refuses to settle. If you believe the vigilante accounts, Plummer was one of the most dangerous men in the Old West, not because he was loud or reckless, but because he was controlled, intelligent, and charming. He could patrol the streets as sheriff by day and direct road agents by night. He could speak of law, order, and reform, while quietly giving information to men waiting in the dark. He could appear to be a gentleman while living as the secret head of a band of thieves and murderers. That is the Outlaw Sheriff story. But if you believe the skeptical side, then Henry Plummer was something else. A flawed, violent, complicated man whose past made him easy to accuse, whose office made him convenient to blame, and whose death helped the vigilantes justify their own rise to power. In that version, Plummer was not proven guilty. He was selected, condemned, and hanged by men who became the authors of his reputation. Even after his death, the legend would not leave him alone. Stories spread about his grave being disturbed. One legend says a doctor removed his right arm to search for the bullet lodged in there from the Crawford shooting. Another says men dug up his grave around the turn of the century, severed the head, and carried it back to a saloon, where it supposedly remained until the building burned. There was even stories that his skull was sent east to be studied, as if science could discover in the bone why a man became evil. That may be the strangest part of all. Even in death, people were still trying to solve Henry Plummer. And that is where the story must end. Not with certainty, because certainty is exactly what this story denies us. Henry Plummer may have been the outlaw sheriff, a brilliant criminal who used law as a disguise. Or he may have been a violent but wrongly condemned man, hanged by vigilantes who need their own version of justice to stand unchallenged. The truth may even lie somewhere in between, a man guilty of some things, innocent of others, destroyed by a frontier world where reputation, fear, and rumor could become as deadly as any bullet. What we know is this: on the 10th of January 1864, Henry Plummer was not convicted in a courtroom. He was not sentenced by a judge. He was not given the chance to face witnesses, challenge evidence, or defend himself under law. He was taken by armed men and hanged. And for more than a century and a half, the question has remained: did the vigilantes kill the chief of the road agents, or did they hang a sheriff and then write the story that made it justice? Before I end this, according to History.net, after 129 years, Plummer finally saw his day in court. On the 7th of May 1993, a posthumous trial was held in Virginia City. The 12 registered voters on jury, after hearing both sides, voted 6-6, a split verdict, which Judge Barbara Brooke declared a mistrial. If Plummer was alive today, he would have been a free man. So what do y'all think? I'm genuinely curious on your thoughts. Was Henry Plummer rightfully hanged, or was he an innocent man caught up in vigilante justice? I hope you all enjoyed this episode on Henry Plummer. If you did, please give a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you hear podcasts, please give a 5-star rating and leave a review. I always love hearing from y'all. Join the Wild West Deep Dives family. For just $1, you'll get a membership that gives you access to bonus content like the first stagecoach robbery in US history. Thank you all for the recent support. Y'all are absolutely amazing. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.